Thank you for listening to this Forum podcast. Please check out our website for a rich archive of podcasts and writing from contemporary philosophers and other researchers on a wide variety of topics. The Forum is an educational charity dedicated to bringing academic philosophy to a broader audience. Please consider donating to us via our Just Giving page, which you can find on our website. Happy listening.
All right, welcome. To start, I thought I'd just ask you, if you don't mind, to please turn your phones onto silent, but please also feel free to record us, take photos of us, tweet about us. If you could just use the hashtag LSE Festival. This event's being recorded. We have a podcast that you can access via the forum's website, also via iTunes. So please also recognize that when the audience question periods come, those questions are also recorded, so you'll have to please wait until the roving mic comes round to you. Make sure to speak into the roving mic. So welcome to the Forum for European Philosophy. Today's forum is about the evolution of altruism. And quite simply, animals and also humans help each other. But why would they do that in a survival of the fittest environment where it's sort of tooth and claw, every animal for themselves? So here to help us get to the bottom of this, we have Dr. Jonathan Birch. He's an assistant professor at the London School of Economics. He's also the author of the new book, The Philosophy of Social Evolution, through Oxford University Press. If you'd like to follow up on the issues that come up in this discussion, this is an excellent starting place. We also have with us Dr. Hanna Rubin. She is a philosopher of biology and a postdoctoral researcher in theoretical philosophy at the University of Groningen. And finally, we have Dr. Heikki Helanterä, who is a biologist and a group leader at the Center for Excellence in Biological Interactions at the University of Helsinki. Now, the Forum for European Philosophy, it's a nonprofit organization. We run these events thanks to the very kind donations of people like you, people like our listeners. So if you would like to make a donation and continue these wonderful podcasts, please visit the website. You can find the donate button there. So let's launch off. We'll begin with a few comments by Dr. Jonathan Birch on what is the philosophy of altruism.
What are we talking about?
Yeah, what are we talking about, Jonathan?
Thanks very much, Brian, and thanks everyone for coming. Yes, we tend to think of evolution, particularly evolution by natural selection, as being this struggle for existence, survival of the fittest, a kind of war of all against all, nature red in tooth and claw. And yet, in some sense, that can't be the whole story, because when we look around us in the natural world, that's not all we see. We see a lot of selfish behaviour, we see a lot of aggression, we see a lot of animals protecting their own interests, but we also see a lot of apparent cooperation, and in some cases, behaviour that is apparently just extremely altruistic, that it is kind of extreme acts of self-sacrifice. Social insects, particularly ants and bees, are perhaps the best known examples. Some of Heikki's work, for instance, on ants, gives some fantastic examples, where there's a species of ant in Brazil where, in all ant societies you have the workers and the queen, and the workers are dedicating their lives to the raising of the queen's larvae. But these ants in Brazil take this to extremes, because every night some ants have to seal the nest so that the nest is protected for the night from predators, and they have to seal it from the outside. So these ants seal the nest from the outside, and then they're going to die overnight. They're not going to survive to the next day, but to all appearances, they've done this so that the rest of the colony can survive. And then there are some ants that just spend their entire lives as basically living honeypots, just hanging off the roof of the nest, storing food for the rest of the ants. But it's not just ants. Some of my favourite examples are in microorganisms, organisms too small for the eye to see. The cover of my book is a nice photo by a biologist called Scott Solomon at Rice University, of a social amoeba. Amoebas called Dictyostelium discoideum. And in each one of these little orbs you can see on the cover of the book, there are tens of thousands of these little amoebas aggregating. So for most of their lives, these amoebas are just single-celled organisms living in the soil, doing amoeba-y sort of things. And then, when food gets scarce, when the going gets tough, they sense how many other amoebas there are in the soil around them. And if there's a critical number, they all get together and aggregate. They aggregate into a kind of mobile slug-like thing called a pseudoplasmodium or a grex that kind of moves along as one in the direction of heat and light. And then when they get to a suitable place, they do this. They form these fruiting bodies where about 20% of the cells die, 20% of the amoebas die, and they form the stalk. They're forming a dead stalk so that the other 80% can work their way up to the top. And when they're at the top, they can release spores to sort of escape the tough conditions they endured in their own lives. So it's almost irresistible, even though these are just amoebas, or just ants, just bees, it's almost completely irresistible to think of this as a kind of altruism, a kind of self-sacrifice. So it's not just humans, it's not just ants and bees even. This is a very widespread phenomenon in the natural world that just cries out for explanation.
Jonathan, I have a personal question for you. I know you have a little boy. Are you the type of ant that would seal off the nest, or would you be the one that stays inside? And if you would seal it off, why would you do that?
You mean how altruistic am I personally?
Or organisms more generally. I mean, why do they do these things?
None of us really know, do we? Unless we're put into that sort of situation. We think of... there's a lot of suggestive parallels between human altruism and altruism in the natural world, right? I mean, if you think of Captain Oates and the expedition to the Antarctic saying, I'm going out now in maybe some time, sort of realizing his own death was nigh, sacrificing himself, going outside the tent so that the rest of the expedition could carry on. Ants do something very similar. Right? The ants that are diseased, that are very ill, the ants will leave the nest so that they minimize the risk of transmitting the disease to the other ants. But in the ants, this behavior is kind of programmed, presumably. It's sort of, in some sense, in the genes. In humans, it's not. In humans, it's an incredibly complicated psychological phenomenon that is not simply genetically determined. And in a way, I think, because it's not determined by our genes, we can't really know exactly how altruistic we are until we find ourselves in a situation that calls for it.
Have either of you found yourself in a situation where you were the sealing off ant?
Can't say I have.
Not yet, no.
Well, we'd be dead, right?
Yeah, fair enough.
Thankfully not. So, I mean, JBS Haldane, the kind of UCL geneticist, great at coming up with really vivid examples to illustrate these kind of dilemmas, right? And there's a sort of story about him in the pub with his graduate student, John Maynard Smith, and John Maynard Smith sort of asked him, suppose you're looking out over a river and you see a drowning person in the river. When would it be in your... would you jump into the river or not to save them? And Haldane was a geneticist. He was thinking about when it would be in his genetic interests to jump in and save the person drowning in the river. And he said, I'd do it if it were 2 brothers or 8 cousins. So in a way, yes, I mean, he went on to sort of point out that, of course, we don't really make those calculations. Right? The evolution of altruism is not about what calculations the individual makes. It's sort of about what the evolutionary processes are that might favour the kind of general dispositions, to be altruistic in that kind of situation.
So, I mean, you suggested that there are some interesting similarities then between ants and humans, but also some crucial differences between ants and humans. Do any of you, right, in general, but also in terms of how they calculate their altruistic behavior, do any of you have any thoughts on what exactly those differences amount to?
Well, I mean, certainly in social insects, the cooperation is always between genetic relatives. Right? So the workers are all sisters, basically, all raising the larvae of the queen, who's their mother. And that genetic relatedness, that fact that they're descended from the same parent, that they're genetically close kin, not always that close, there's not always just one queen, but they're always related to some degree. That seems to be really crucial in sustaining their altruism. When we look to humans, of course we face a puzzle, because altruism in humans is not always directed at close genetic relatives, despite Haldane's quip.
So you're telling me if I took an ant from a different nest and I asked it to go do the sealing off behaviour, it would not be interested in this?
Have you tried this, Heikki?
We didn't try it, but my guess is that it wouldn't work. Ants are the altruism of ants. It is always, like Jonathan said, it's always family based, and they don't do mental calculations of who is likely to be a brother or a sister or a cousin, but they rely on very crude rules of thumb that this individual smells like my nestmates, I'm on my home territory, my altruism is now targeted towards kin. They have very rough behavioral rules that on average guarantee that the altruism goes to genetically similar individuals. There are exceptions. There are cheaters, there are parasites that invade colonies and take advantage of the crude recognition mechanisms and behave like cuckoos and enter the nest of another ant species or a conspecific nest. But these are sort of the altruistic rules of thumb misfiring, and if there's a good working system in nature, it's also likely that somebody is going to find a way to exploit that system as a parasite, and ants do that as well. They are not altruists towards ants in the next mound. They are only altruists in a very limited.
So it's parochial
setting.
In a way. It's within the family.
Extremely parochial. Yeah.
So that's
I was going to say, even in humans, we're altruistic towards random people that we've never met and will never see again, but there is still some sort of calculation based on kinship. If your brother loses his job, you're more likely to then say, oh, come live with me for a while, I don't care if, it's inconvenient to me. But if a random stranger, you're not going to let that random stranger into your house to live with you just out of some feeling of altruism towards them.
And that's the kind of kernel of truth in Haldane's quip, right? That we don't really calculate 2 brothers or 8 cousins, but we do tend to favour, the people to whom we're most strongly altruistic and supportive do tend to be our close kin.
But is it, and when you mention the random stranger, I'm worried that the random stranger is going to steal my stuff, that I don't know the person. There's a sort of negative, possibility associated with the visit.
I guess letting a random stranger into your house isn't the best example, but...
you think also, all else being equal, if it were somebody that I were confident that it would be no more or less annoying than my cousin.
Yeah, you're more likely to help your cousin, all else being...
Still more likely to help my cousin.
It's wonderful that it works at all, isn't it? Human cooperation. It's wonderful that Airbnb works, for example. People do let strangers into their house in return
that's for money, not interest.
Yeah, and I prefer that they have 5-star rating myself. You can be risky or not risky when you take on these Airbnbs.
It's bringing out the importance of reputation in humans. Not in the ants, but in the humans. Cooperation between individuals who are not genetic relatives is crucially sustained by reputational consequences. You stand to benefit by cultivating a good reputation, and you stand to lose by doing something that will injure your reputation.
Yeah, and then it's not altruism in the narrow and strict sense. It's more like cooperation based on mutual benefits, either direct reciprocal mutual benefits or something that occurs through reputation effects. And of course, compared to the altruism by ants who are sacrificing all of their personal reproduction, that's from an evolutionary biologist, that's the ultimate self-sacrifice, that you are not reproducing at all. The examples of human altruism are really that extreme. So that's from an ant biologist. That's the main difference in the altruism. It's ant societies, it's obligate, it's non-negotiable, and it's extreme. So it's
and genetic relatedness is crucial in allowing that, because it's, you're helping your genes persist into the future by sacrificing your own reproduction to help that of the queen.
Yeah, and also, I mean, like, of course, when we think about altruism in social insects, the first examples that come to mind are these extreme ones, that the honeybee worker that stings you is going to be ripped apart because the sting stays on your skin, and the worker will die due to that, or the ants that freeze to death after they seal their colony entrances. But of course, I mean, any honeybee worker or an ant worker is already an extreme altruist, even if they don't do this extreme self-sacrifice by killing themselves, because they have already born as individuals who are never going to reproduce. So they are, any social insect worker is already an extreme altruist. So it's whether they are then going to commit suicide to help the colonies is then, that's a very small addition to the altruistic behavior. They are all evolutionary dead ends for their personal reproduction already. So.
Well, why don't we open up the forum to a few questions from the audience? There's a roving mic that's going around, but so if you'd like to ask a question or raise a comment, go ahead and please put your hand up now. All right, we'll start with the gentleman here in the bottom right.
I thought it was interesting that you talked about reputation and you know, we're prone to gossip, we're prone to telling stories about each other or whatever. So I was wondering, various mechanisms have been proposed for evolution of altruism, and you want to have some way of directing altruistic acts towards other altruism. And one method that's been proposed is a green beard effect, where you have, you can recognize an altruist and you act towards an altruist by some external marker. How much can you see reputation as a greenbeard effect in terms of directing altruistic acts towards other altruists?
Right. Thanks. Of course, it depends how exactly you define greenbeard effect. I'll just, I love the term. Right, this is a term from Richard Dawkins, based on some comments by Bill Hamilton. That Dawkins is trying to imagine situations in which altruism might evolve without close sort of family relations. And he's thinking, well, suppose there was a gene that did the following three things. First, it causes you to grow a green beard. Secondly, it causes you to go and seek out other individuals who have green beards. And thirdly, it causes you to behave altruistically towards those other individuals with green beards. And Dawkins asked, well, could that trait spread, even if the people with green beards were not actually close family members? And he said, yes, it could spread, because what it has is that crucial condition for the evolution of altruism, which is that the benefits conferred by that trait are falling differentially on other individuals who have that trait. So it's increasing the frequency in future populations of that green beard trait, because it's people with green beards who get the benefits. And yes, so the question is, to what extent is reputation a bit like that? Well, of course, it is a bit like that, but not entirely like that, because it's not. Reputation is not necessarily a marker of your genes. It's a record of your past behaviour, and so in a way, it's within your control to a greater extent than your genes are. Right? You can't really control which individuals resemble you genetically, but you can, to some extent, control your reputation through your own actions. So in a way, you can see the benefits of reputation as sort of flowing directly to you. They're a kind of direct fitness effect, and a result of your own behaviour over the long term, which is not necessarily present in the greenbeard effects. But it is a fantastic example. And they exist in ants, right?
There are some examples of greenbeard.
Not literal green beards.
No, not literally, but there are examples of ant colonies. I guess this is more an example of not behaving altruistically towards other greenbeards, but attacking the individuals who don't carry the green beard. So it's more of a negative example that there are some genetic loci where ant colonies seem to be able to exclude individuals, even if they would be kin otherwise across the whole genome. They seem to be attacking individuals who don't carry a particular allele at a particular particular loci.
Yes, it's based on smell, is it? The marker is something smell.
Yeah, so this, I think it's quite a large chunk of the genome that is actually associated with this marker, but it's certain that odors play a large role, and there are genes coding for odors in that genomic region, and of course that's how ants. If there's anything special that ants do, it's very likely that odors are playing a role, because that's the world they live in. They are functioning largely based on smell, of course. Yeah.
So the important difference really between green beards and reputation is that you can have the green beard without being an altruist, but you can't really get a reputation for being an altruist without being an altruist. So they're quite similar in one sense, but they're also quite dissimilar in another sense.
But I mean, if there's some kind of a signal of reputation, there is a risk that some individuals would try to fake that signal of reputation. Similarly, that the green beard system is vulnerable to this.
Yeah, so if you can get a reputation for being an altruist somehow without being an altruist, I wouldn't really call that a reputation-based evolution of altruism. But you could have a sort of physical marker as a human, sort of like that becomes culturally associated maybe with being an altruist, and then that's then a sign that you're an altruist.
Yeah, and then that's similarly vulnerable than the green beard system. The green beard systems are thought to be rare in nature because they can be beat by individuals who carry the green beard but are not.
Got this vulnerability to subversion, like by sometimes the people in this area call them false beards.
False
exactly, beards, people who fake the signal, so fake the smell. And in the same way, if there's a way to fake your reputation or to get it dishonestly, individuals can gain
sort of
from that.
Pretend I'm going to donate to charity, but don't actually ever give the money or something like that.
I mean, that happens all the time. This is a major problem. People who you take to be disingenuous. And I suppose I'd be curious to know what you think. How much of human apparent altruistic behavior is really the sort of calculated reputational behavior, where they're trying to build up social credit? But are they ever really truly altruistic?
I mean, it's hard to tell how much. I mean, there's certainly cases where it's not reputation based. I mean, there's been experiments putting people in labs where they're just sitting at computers, they don't know who they're interacting with, and so there's no sort of expectation that they're going to build any reputation from giving up some of their earnings from the experiment for the other person. Yet people do give up some money and give it to other people. So one classic example is what's called the Dictator Game in game theory. So basically you give a person in a laboratory some amount of money, like $10 or something, and they're interacting with another person at another computer, they don't know who it is, and they're told you can offer some distribution of this money. You could keep 9 and give them 1, keep 8 and give them 2 or something like that. And people, I mean, they don't give everything to the other person, but oftentimes they offer a fairly equal split of the money. Most people give at least something to the other person, and there's no sort of explanation of that except for that they care about the other person. They care about being altruistic, even towards perfect strangers.
Jonathan, you mentioned earlier the role of Hamilton's thinking in these sorts of issues. Did you want to comment on that?
Yes, of course, because it's the LSE festival, right? W.D. Hamilton, Bill Hamilton. I think one of LSE's most illustrious alumni. Rarely even remembered as an alumnus, because I think he basically hated it. He was here as a graduate student in the early 60s. He was enrolled in the Department of Sociology. His first published paper on the evolution of altruistic behaviour has the LSE affiliation, but he never used it again. He never admitted to being at LSE. The reason for that is that he submitted a paper to Nature that subsequently, when published in a different journal, one of the most influential papers ever written in evolutionary theory, but it was desk rejected by Nature. And he heard sort of through the grapevine that it had been desk rejected because someone just looked at the cover page and it said Department of Sociology, LSE, and they said, oh, we don't publish sociology. So he was also jointly registered at UCL at the Galton Laboratory. But according to his biographer, Alika Segerstral, he didn't really like that either. He was the sort of guy who was very solitary and worked on buses, and in Waterloo Station was one of his favourite places to work. But this was all in the early 60s. The work he was doing just completely changed the way we think about the evolution of altruism and social behaviour. And he basically took that thought that was expressed in that quip from Haldane about 2 brothers or 8 cousins. Hamilton disputed whether that quip ever really happened. It was a kind of battle over priority. But took the basic idea, that basic sort of kernel of insight that we have this evolutionary incentive to help our relatives, and used it as the basis for a mathematically rigorous, brilliant theory called inclusive fitness theory. That, you know, even today for insect researchers and people working on humans, it continues to shape the way we think about how social behaviour evolves. We think of animals as being trying to maximise their inclusive fitness, where this is a kind of measure of how much your behaviour is getting your genes represented in future populations. Do you think do ants maximise their inclusive fitness?
I mean, my view is that if they, I mean, of course, evolution doesn't maximise things in an absolute sense. Evolution doesn't
evolution doesn't have a goal.
It doesn't bring perfection, but to the extent that natural selection and societies maximises anything, then inclusive fitness is very close to what is being maximised at least. But that shouldn't be seen as saying that evolution is producing perfection. That's not the case, of course.
Heikki, why don't you lead us off with a few comments on how the evolution of altruism works more broadly in your research and in ants in particular?
So yeah, of course, for us the bottom line is that relatedness is the key to altruism. Genetic similarity. The Greenberg mechanisms is another way to produce relatedness on a small part of the genome, but in ants and other social insects, social wasps, honeybees, termites, altruism is always family-based. So social insects have, of course, evolved from solitary insects. The evolutionary ancestor, in the case of ants, somewhere 100 million years back, was a solitary wasp. First stages of worker-like behavior. In all cases, when we can sort of reconstruct the evolutionary scenarios based on the current phylogenies, it's always daughters staying at home to help their mother reproduce. It's not random individuals coming together, one becoming a worker and the other one becoming the queen. It's always a daughter staying at home to help the mother. In termites' cases, it's both sons and daughters, but wasps and bees and ants, it's always the workers are always females, and the males play a very, very small role in the colony altogether. So that's sort of the insight number one from inclusive fitness logic, that cooperation and altruism is family based. But then I think what brought me into studying ants is the sort of other side, that okay, we have family based societies where cooperation is the force holding the group together, but these are not clonal groups. Individuals are not genetically identical to each other. There's varying degrees of relatedness there, and that creates conflicts within the colonies as well. So if we look at the genetic structure of an ant nest or a honeybee nest, we can also predict that okay, the cooperation shouldn't be perfect. We can predict that certain class of individuals should prefer another class of individuals over the third class because they are genetically more similar to them. And in many cases, I think those are what people have seen as one of the major triumphs of the inclusive fitness logic, that this kind of conflicts within societies are something that nobody would have predicted without the inclusive fitness insights that the genetic similarity between individuals is very important. So we can observe ant larvae eating eggs that are their more or less distant or close relatives. We can predict that in species that have certain kind of family structures in the nests, this kind of selfish behavior and conflict should be more prominent. We have ant workers killing their brothers in order to feed these brothers to their sisters because they are genetically more similar to the sisters. So that's I think what got me interested in ant research in the first place when I was doing my undergrads in the late 90s. This was really a hot topic in the social insect world, these kin conflicts, and I think that's the other side of inclusive fitness, which I think is really
conflict as well as cooperation.
Yeah, that you predict both, and they are always in a
I just find that the parallels with the cells of our own bodies quite interesting. As Hamilton himself pointed this out, right? You can think of a social insect colony as almost like a kind of cohesive, single superorganism sort of thing. When you think about it that way, you start to think, well, hang on, I can do the reverse of that. I can think about an organism like, you or me, humans, or an individual ant, made up of countless billions of cells, and think, hang on, that organism is a kind of social unit, and not, moreover, a social unit that is made up of close relatives. The cells in your body are close relatives of each other through their common descent from a single fertilized egg.
Yeah, and I think that's the sort of the idea of an ant colony as an organism rather than a collection of organisms. That idea is older than inclusive fitness theory. Yeah. That idea goes back to William Morton Wheeler, and Julian Huxley also wrote about how an ant colony actually is an individual rather than a collection of individuals, making exactly this comparison that we have the queen, that is the germline of the colony, superorganism, and we have the workers that are the somatic cells of the colony organism. But they, of course, they didn't put this into an inclusive fitness or relatedness framework. They recognized that them being families is important, but they didn't talk about genetic relatedness. And then now, of course, in the last 20 years, this idea of evolution being a series of increases in like hierarchical complexity, like how multicellular life evolved from unicellular ancestors and how insect societies evolved from solitary insects, and this is, of course, where the sort of general value of inclusive fitness theory and relatedness thinking.
It's an important idea I argue for in the book, really, that social evolution theory is not just a theory of cooperation, it's not just a theory of altruism, it's a theory of how new levels of organism come into existence. Right? And to me, that's one of the things that's always struck me as a really profound thing about this theory, that it gives us this new perspective on what we are and why we exist. Because for the first few billions of years, right, life on Earth was single-celled life. Single-celled life was getting on absolutely fine. It still is. The vast majority of life is still single-celled. Just bacteria getting on with their business. They have no real need of being multicellular, So you think that's kind of weird that there are these few freaks, in the world of unicellular life. You occasionally come across this freakish thing that's like a mass of billions and billions of cells that are all cooperating with each other. What is that all about? And I think social evolution theory and Hamilton's ideas are giving us fantastic insights into what that is all about. It is about cells that are typically clonal, highly related, descended from a single-cell fertilized egg, cooperating in a way that is stable because of the way they're close relatives.
Hanna, I thought maybe you could comment on the altruistic behavior in these particular freakish clumps of cells that we call humans.
Well, us freakish humans, we cooperate a lot. So as we've already mentioned, humans are altruistic towards our kin, and so a lot of people think that that can be explained using Hamilton's ideas about kin selection. But we're also altruistic towards people we don't know, and even in cases where we think there's no sort of direct benefit to ourselves, cases where there's no reputation to be gained. And so a lot of times when people talk about the evolution of human altruism, they're trying to explain this sort of widespread human altruism. Why are we altruistic towards perfect strangers, basically? And so one thing you might think is, well, kin selection is so important to the rest of the biological world. Can we use this explanation of kin selection to just explain all of this widespread human altruism? Which might seem a bit silly at first, but some people do argue that it can explain this widespread human altruism. And the idea is supposed to be something like, well, our altruistic preferences, our way of viewing other people, evolved back at a time where we were mostly interacting with our family members. So we lived in small kin groups, and so when we interacted with people, we just interacted altruistically. And then biological evolution favored this. But once human groups started growing and we had more and more important interactions with people outside our immediate family members, the altruistic preferences just sort of stayed around. So that's one way some people try to explain why we're just altruistic in general, although it's often sort of dismissed very quickly by other people who refer to it as the big mistake hypothesis, possibly because they think the hypothesis itself is a big mistake, but also because it implies that all of our altruistic actions are just big mistakes. So they're just misfirings of our desire to help kin, even though we're in a world where we no longer primarily interact with kin.
It's about sort of coming to regard the wider community
as
of the country or the world as if they were family members when they're not.
Yeah. So this is often dismissed fairly quickly. I mean, so one of the things you can say is that, other primates distinguish kin from non-kin when they're deciding who to cooperate with, who to be altruistic towards. Another thing you can say is that we're perfectly capable of distinguishing kin from non-kin in other settings. So things like incest aversion show us that we're pretty good from distinguishing kin from non-kin.
Just as well.
Yeah, so that's a good thing. So a lot of times, instead of invoking sort of biological evolution to explain these widespread human altruistic preferences, people will talk about cultural evolution. And for cultural evolution, basically that just means there's a variety of different behaviors in groups of people, and then some of those behaviors are adopted more often than others. So when you're talking about the cultural evolution of altruism, you're trying to explain why altruistic behaviors are not genetically programmed, but why they're adopted by people living in groups of other people.
So give a kind of an analogue of natural selection, sort of an analogue of the Darwinian processes, but now they're happening not at the level of genes, but at the cultural level, at the level of beliefs, ideas, skills, values.
Yeah. So and there's a lot of different ways that people can adopt, different beliefs or different behaviors or different attitudes from people. It could be that, parents teach their children how to behave. They teach them to be nice to other people, and some people have more children than others, and so if people have more children than others and their children have their same views, then you might think that's how a behavior can spread in a population. But that's not the only way, right? Because we look around at other people and we see maybe some behaviors are more prevalent than others, and we want to do what's the most popular thing, or we just learn from our peers, we want to behave like our friends, things like that. So there's a lot of different ways for behaviors to spread through cultural evolution.
I feel like these sort of key concepts we get from Hamilton for understanding social evolution in the genetic case, they have their analogues too in the cultural case, or at least that's one thing I argue, that you can think of there being a kind of cultural relatedness as well as a kind of genetic relatedness, that just as our genes can be correlated if we're brothers or sisters, our beliefs and values can also be correlated because we've been, raised in the same community. And one possibility worth taking seriously, I think, is that human cooperation does tend to be differentially targeted at our cultural relatives, at people who are more likely than average to share the same beliefs and values as we do.
It's not just a big mistake.
Oh, maybe not just a big mistake.
At least it's giving us, a sort of cultural evolution story is just saying there's more to the story than just sort of kin selection going wrong. Yeah.
Why don't we take a few more questions from the audience? We'll take, let's see, the lady in the far back left to begin, and we'll do a couple of questions at once. So if you start first, and then we'll pass the mic to another person, and then we'll proceed.
I wasn't expecting to go first, so I wasn't prepared. I've been quite interested in the idea of ants kind of completely sacrificing their lives altruistically, and it being a self-sacrificial, I will die to make my species succeed. And that's not a way, like if somebody actually sacrificed their life in the human species to help someone else, that is a massive deal. That's really that must have been a really extreme example, and it's quite
rare,
interesting.
yeah, much rarer.
Yeah. So it's quite interesting that, do you think perhaps, is it no longer about evolution, altruism in the human species, and how none of us are really willing to sacrifice huge groups of humanity to help us? And now there's quite a lot of us, and it's almost becoming self-destructive in there being like, no, we all help each other, all survive, to the point where there being so many of us that we've got a lot of problems with the overpopulations of humanity. And how do you think sometimes, this is quite like a little bit of a devil's advocate kind of question, do you think it's kind of crucial that there are groups of species that will sacrifice their selves and their lives as well to help us as a species survive? You need to have groups like actually dying to help, or do you think it's valuable in humanity for it to be just kind of to help each other out and be nice to each other?
I mean, there certainly are cases where people will sacrifice their lives for other people. I mean, you have people in the military, you have firefighters who risk their lives, policemen, things like that. But you're right that it is a sort of smaller subset of altruistic behavior in humans.
And of course, they're not doing it for the sake of the species, but crucially, neither are the ants. Right? It's not that kind of for the good of the species sort of argument turns out not to really work, because evolution doesn't really happen at the species level in that way. It's not species competing with each other. Think about it this way: that the ant is doing it for its own close relatives. The ant's doing it for the queen.
Unfortunately, evolution doesn't work to preserve the species. It's evolution is still always, to some extent, about competition within the species. Even if we find amazing examples of cooperation and altruism, competition over whose genes or cultural traits will be in the next generation, that competition will always be there as well. So the good of the species is not where evolution is.
It's absolutely the case that social evolution is not always good for the species and can be very bad. And it's entirely possible that you can have lots of groups internally really cooperative, like these ants colonies, cooperating wonderfully with each other, but their conflict between each other, the conflict between groups, is so destructive that it tears the species apart.
And I mean this also goes back to the early 60s and Bill Hamilton, because at that time I think a lot of the evolutionary biology and population biology, there was a lot of theories and ideas of how individuals are doing certain things to help the population, and I think Hamilton's thinking was one of the main ingredients in showing that thinking doesn't hold up to evolutionary theory scrutiny. So I think that's how.
Yes, you do occasionally get these super colonies, right, where the nests have found a way to sort of overcome the conflict between them, and they're cooperating in these massive super colonies of many nests. You sort of think if we could be like that.
Well, yeah, that is that's something I've been working a lot in the recent years, that we do have ant societies that seem to sort of defy this inclusive fitness Hamiltonian logic of helping your close relatives. Individuals seem to be interacting with non-related individuals, but actually usually in those cases as well, if we look far enough, there is going to be a border, there is going to be the next supercolony.
There will be conflict.
There is going to be a territory and a conflict, and the cases where we don't find these borders and conflict seem to be something that has been caused by that these species have been introduced by human action to novel environments, and they are not probably at an evolutionary stable situation. But we have interesting situations where this logic seems to be shaky, at least at the moment.
It's one of the sad things, I suppose, about social evolution theory, that there's always conflict somewhere. What you have is, selection between nests, say, can end up really strongly putting a premium on cooperating well within the nests. But at some level, you always get to a point at which there's some competition that is driving the evolution of the cooperation within a localized group or area.
Yeah, so this is similar to how a lot of people think human altruism evolved as well, where you had competition between groups. There was extensive warfare and competition over scarce resources, and then you had groups where people were cooperating, behaving altruistically towards each other, and they sort of, in a war, in a fight, or when there's limited resources, the group would be better at surviving than a group where people weren't willing to defend the other people in their group or share some of their food or things like that.
It's one of the sort of paradoxes of explaining human evolution in this way. Like Sam Bowles and Herbert Gintis make this kind of argument that human cooperation, we've become this incredibly cooperative species because of unbelievably intense, horrible warfare between human groups throughout the Pleistocene. There's always this sort of internal kind of paradox almost of these hypotheses, that to get the really strong cooperation within groups, you have to put into the model really nasty, intense competition between groups.
The next question was the lady with glasses there, yes? And then we'll follow that with somebody up here in the front.
Thank you. It's a really interesting discussion. I'm a clinician, I'm a doctor, so I think that is a really big gap between ants and humans. And we sort of very conveniently skip all other evolutional steps, which can be quite complex. And I think that a lot of examples of altruism is seen between mother and child in mammals, for example, but it might be more difficult to reproduce ant effect. So that was just a beginning. The question is, sometimes we can get idea about evolutional stages from physiology. So which parts of the brains are fired during the altruistic events? So it's not a logical decision, isn't it? It's sort of almost intuitive decision that must have fire dopaminergic pathways because it makes us feel good. Even if it is something that person sacrifices money or life or goes through hardship, it actually makes them feel really good. So the question is, do you have any clues from the physiology of the brain, from functional MRIs, which parts of the brain are activated during altruistic steps in humans to guide us development, sort of in terms of human chronology development?
I have no idea.
Well, of course, I mean, none of us do fMRI scans, but I think it's, to me, it seems an emotional thing, right? I think there's some indication that these, you give people these anonymous games in the lab, and if they do it once, they're more likely to cooperate than if they play it over and over again. There's a sense that if you do it enough times, if your emotional, intuitive responses end up being desensitized, switching off, and sort of cold reason takes over, people become more selfish.
Yeah, so I don't know which part of the brain lights up
because
or anything like that,
you
but
can
it is...
link that parts of the brain to the steps of human evolution.
Yeah.
So there are some parts of the brain that developed very long time ago, and some are quite recent, like the cortex.
I'm sure there are laboratories that have the equipment to do that. I just don't know enough about brain studies to really report on
it's
that.
It's a great debate, right? I think it's not a question we've resolved, but this idea of, I mean, human evolution is characterized by, of course, a great expansion in our intelligence and our rational capabilities and the cortex, but also our emotional capabilities and our affective system, and our ability to have these fast, intuitive moral judgments. And so you get these dual process theories of cooperation and of altruism and of moral judgment, where we've got both processes going on at once. We've got the sort of slow calculation of what we should do, and then you've got the fast, intuitive, emotional responses. And then it leaves room for debate, right, about which is more altruistic. And I tend to think it's probably the emotionally driven judgments are more likely to be altruistic more of the
Something
time.
like a gut feeling.
Yeah, gut feelings.
And
exactly.
I mean, there's a lot of evidence that a lot of our altruistic behavior is not just based on emotion, but based on imitation. So there have been experiments about how often children will imitate altruistic behavior. So they put them in like a little waiting area in one experiment, and they see someone playing like this bowling game, and if you like win that round on the bowling game, you get some sort of payment. And they watch this person play the bowling game, and when that person is putting their money into like a jar for donating to charity, the child who's playing the bowling game next is much more likely to then put their winnings in the jar donating to charity as well, instead of like keeping their money and buying candy with it or whatever. So it's a lot of emotion, but it's also a lot of imitation of other people's behavior.
That was the second part of my question.
I'm sorry, there were several questions, I'm afraid. We should probably move on to one more, but thank you very much for
Okay.
that.
The Max Planck Institute, they do a lot of research on the neuroscience of altruism, with Wolfinger and Wolfinger's daughter, and also there's a couple of books about that with Wolfinger and Ignat Mathieu, I think.
Thank you. So the comment for the listeners was the Max Planck Institute for further information on neuroscience, sure. The gentleman here in the very front, thanks.
Thank you very much. In fact, I want to expand a little bit on this, on the initial comment on the previous question. We draw these analogies between human altruism and altruism in other species, especially in social insects. And something bothers me about this sort of contrast between the humans. Are we really talking about the same thing? Humans are conscious, we understand, we sacrifice, we lose our lives, we understand that when we do that. Do really ants sacrifice themselves? There are mechanisms which these species developed to behave in a particular way, but is it really an altruism? Are we talking about altruism here?
Yes, you're wondering about the intentional language we inevitably fall into.
Yes, in a way, what I'm saying is that by telling this story, we anthropomorphize these creatures and think about them in this way.
Yes, of course, there's a danger of that. I think it's important to distinguish two ways in which the term altruism is used. Right? There's an ordinary sense, and also used in psychology, where altruism is about motivation. And altruism is about acting in a way that is motivated by concern for others. And do humans ever do that? Well, I think so, sometimes. Do ants do that? Well, that's a harder question. Probably not. They may well not have enough mentality for us to really intelligibly talk of them being motivated by concern for others. And when we look at the amoebas, I don't think they're really motivated by concern for others. But that should be distinguished from biological altruism, right, where altruism has taken on a life of its own as a kind of technical term in biology, where in biology altruism is about reproduction. It's about doing something that seems to defy Darwinian logic because it impairs your own chances of reproducing in such a way as to increase the chances of reproducing of another organism. And do amoebas do that? Well, yes, they do, and ants do that. So these notions come apart, and perhaps sometimes we're psychologically altruistic without being biologically altruistic, as when we help our own children. That's kind of helping our own direct reproductive success in the Darwinian sense, but it can still be psychologically altruistic. And also we can sometimes be biologically, we can sometimes be biologically altruistic without being psychologically altruistic, I think. If you imagine a soldier or something who goes into a war zone, but is not motivated by concern for others, but just by the desire for a paycheck or something like that. These notions can come apart in lots of ways.
It makes me wonder about the advantage of diversity, though. So it sounds like a lot of the advantage you get from altruistic behavior is then associated with people who are very, very similar to you in one way or another, either genetically or socially. But then, of course, there's some advantage to having some diversity in a species just to be more resistant to natural selective pressures. Can altruism work against you in this way of making your colony, too unified? All the altruism is only working to save the people that are just like each other.
Well, I think in social insect studies, how people see this is of course that if you have altruism is maximally selected for in a genetically uniform family setting, but a genetically uniform family setting is also a very good place for parasites and pathogens, for example, to cause problems. That whether this selection for increased genetic diversity through pathogen resistance is enough to offset the costs that would come from perhaps decreased selection for altruism. That's something
It's a good question. It's one of Hamilton's other big ideas. So my book is focusing on Hamilton's work on social behaviour and kin selection, but the other thing he's best known for is this hypothesis about the evolution of sex. Why do organisms reproduce sexually? That's kind of wasteful and weird. If you think of it from the point of view of a bacterium, I'm fine. I'm just splitting in half every 20 minutes. That's really, really quick, really efficient. Why would you reproduce sexually? In a way, all of the males are just completely wasted because they don't gestate a new organism. All they do is produce a tiny bit of DNA that fertilizes an egg. And Hamilton was thinking, why on earth does selection ever lead to sexual reproduction? And his answer was that it's crucial for disease resistance. It's crucial that the population has this churn of genetic diversity, genes being mixed up all the time, so that parasites and pathogens can't just evolve to target a particular set of genes so effectively that they just kill everyone.
It would not have been my first intuition that the role of men is actually disease resistance.
Yes, and it must be a really... To offset the cost of having men around. If you think of how many more offspring could be produced if everyone was a woman. The cost of having men around is huge in Darwinian terms. And there must be a huge benefit in the form of genetic diversity.
And that's also a good example of how evolution doesn't favour what's good for the growth rate of the population.
Yeah.
A population with very few males and a lot of females would grow much faster than a population with a 50-50 sex ratio, and a 50-50 sex ratio is something we observe in most species with separate sexes. So that's a very good example of how natural selection works at the level of individual benefits and not what's good for the population. So.
Good. We had a couple more questions. Why don't we take the lady here on the bottom right?
Thank you. Yes, I'm sorry for being a little bit late, so I'm not sure if you touched upon this already, but as you were talking about that altruism has been regarded as something that you help your family and people nearby, but then also as mentioned that with the Dictator Game, we can see that there still is a need or a desire to help people without any gains per se other than helping people. How come, I would love to hear your opinion, that some people are much more inclined to be altruistic and they will seek to help out people they have nothing in common with on the other side of the world. Some people are the happiest when they just have the family and helping the people around them. And also, I guess this is a side question to this, that now with the society becoming global and with media, shouldn't that have increased altruism by diminishing the borders between people around the world?
people's behaviour does vary in these games, right?
Yeah, I mean, so one thing Jonathan said before is that it's much more complicated in humans because it's not something that's necessarily genetically programmed, and so a lot of it has to do with, you know, who and what actions you see as you're growing up. Like I said, a lot of it has to do with imitations. So if you're not brought up in a sort of family that teaches you to be altruistic, then you're less likely to have that behavior. Yeah, and people's behavior does vary in this Dictator game. I mean, especially in things with, like, in the laboratory, though, a lot of that isn't necessarily about how altruistic the person is, but how they understand the situation they've been put into, because it's not a sort of everyday situation, and so the way that they think about what kind of interaction am I having also can affect your behavior as well.
Certainly one of the effects of globalization is that altruistic behavior is now much, much broader than it ever was before. I suppose you used to have to be altruistic in your family, but now, I mean, even especially in the UK, giving what you can, 80,000 hours, there are these charities whose aim is to be altruistic, really, and donate huge amounts of resources to people that you never meet, you know, that are far, far away.
Parochialism still exists.
Yeah.
I think it's a great question. You know, given what we know, which is not all that much, but it's more than we did, about where human altruism comes from, is there anything we can do? Are there any interventions we can target to try and make people more altruistic? You know, if you think that we have these evolved sort of parochial, tribal instincts, you know, if you think that we are disposed to be most altruistic towards our kin and then perhaps next most altruistic towards people we recognise as being similar to us from the same cultural group as us, how can we get over that? Like, what can we do to try and structure people's environments in such a way that they're not as sensitive to these in-group, out-group distinctions, that they're not as tribal, that they think of people in Africa, say, as being, you know, equally worthy of the basic needs being met as the people who live in the same town as them in the UK. It's a difficult question. I just hope, all I can say is I hope that in some way this research feeds into that and is in some way helpful.
Yeah, so there's tons of interesting research on in-group versus out-group biases. I mean, there's a lot of experiments that, like, if you, flip a coin and first half the people it comes up heads and half the people it comes up tails, and you put them into groups based on that, and you're like, okay, you're the people where the coin came up heads and you're the people where coin came up tails. They'll form in-group biases based on something as totally meaningless as that, and they'll cooperate much more with this person got a heads on the coin group versus those people with the tails. I don't know about them.
Good. So there was another question here in the middle.
Thank you. Earlier you were talking about the Dictator game and how we still observe some people giving money despite the anonymous condition that they're in. And as I understand it, a lot of the reputationalist, altruist people who say that altruism is just like trying to establish a good reputation, account for this by saying, you know, like people have these like emotional proximate causes that induce them to, you know, give. And because anonymity is such an unusual condition to be in, it's just the metabolic cost of just being always proximately motivated to be like giving in these situations means that people are built to just give, and the fact that they're in an anonymous state is just a mistake. So they're just making it's another type of mistake.
Yeah, it's another type of
I'm wondering
mistake. Yeah.
How much credence do you give this argument? Do you find it compelling? Why or why not?
So not necessarily. I mean, I'm sure that has something to do with the explanation of why these people are giving in the Dictator game. Although, as Jonathan said, if you have people play these sorts of games multiple times, the sort of emotional reaction disappears, and they sort of think about, okay, what's the rational thing to do given what I actually really care about? And in these sort of Dictator games, if you have the people play over and over again, they do sort of start to give less, but it bottoms out at a certain level. Like, if you play it like 10 times, you sort of give less for a while, but you're not willing to give nothing I mean, some people are willing to give nothing to the other person, but there are still people after playing the game several times where you would think they sort of have more rationally thought through the situation they're actually in. They still do give money, and so it's less clear that it's a sort of misfiring in that kind of case.
I'm not sure I like the language of kind of misfiring, big mistake hypothesis, because even if you think, well, from a strict kind of Darwinian point of view, a lot of human altruism is a mistake. It doesn't promote our inclusive fitness. That's a mistake that itself has a history, and that can itself be a target of explanation for cultural evolution, and that is sustained by social norms and sustained by the way we expect each other to behave. So it's only a mistake in a very restricted sense. It's in another sense it's something to be explained by a different kind of evolutionary process.
Yeah, I mean, if we have cultural norms and ways of copying behaviors of others, we have to look at the balance. In what situations do those behavioral or copying rules pay off, and what is the proportion where they misfire, so to speak? It's which part do we want to focus on? We can say that these behavioral rules work very well on average. In most cases, they do exactly the right thing, and then there's this small part of the space where they go wrong, but we can still say that they are good rules. So
great. The lady in the bottom right here.
I wondered whether you had looked, or anyone had looked at all at altruism between species that are non-human. I'm thinking of things like birds that give humans gifts, different types of animals that work together, like orcas and dolphins, I think it is. And recently I've seen a really lovely, fascinating little video of a parrot deciding that a couple of young cats were bored and taking a milk bottle off a milk bottle and fashioning it into a toy, which it then gave to the kittens for them to play with. I cannot understand why. I was fascinated why it should want to do that. But I do think there's a lot going on at the non-human level that we haven't begun to tap. I'm a complete non-specialist. I work for one of the altruistic organisations.
Well, I guess, I mean, the cooperation between species is already something that I think Darwin was considering as a potential problem to his logic. I mean, we have a lot of very intimate symbiotic mutualistic relationships between species, and of course how evolutionary biologists define genetic relatedness across species. It's not possible. It's always, in the technical sense, going to be zero. So we have to look for some direct benefits for the parties that have to be there to keep these relationships evolutionarily stable. And I know there's a lot of examples of vertebrates behaving altruistically towards individuals of another species, and I don't see any direct benefits there. So I think for an evolutionary biologist, they are a mystery. So we have to look for other explanations than biological fitness for those cases.
Right, and potentially culture. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, I entirely agree that all over the natural world we find mutualistic cooperation across species, even in our own bodies. With the gut flora in our gut, we cooperate with bacteria mutualistically. Even in our own cells, you can think of the mitochondria as originally beginning as a symbiont of the cell. So symbiosis is everywhere, but these cases of apparent altruism are much harder to explain. But I think that culture is not a uniquely human thing. Cultural evolution is not a uniquely human thing. There's good reason to think cultures exist in dolphins and whales and chimpanzees of a sort. And if there's culture of a sort, if there are different norms and practices, different groups transmit down the generations through learning, then there's the possibility for cultural evolution and the possibility for the evolution of altruism that is on a kind of long genetic leash, but that is mainly underpinned by cultural beliefs and values, just like we see in humans.
Do you see more altruism in these sorts of, cultural animal species? So if I'm looking at chimpanzees and dolphins, am I more likely to see altruism than if I'm looking at solitary animals?
Well, if you're comparing it to ants, no. I mean, chimpanzees are horrible. I mean, they're really not nice to each other.
And not at least altruism in the biological sense that there would be individuals giving up their reproduction. We don't have dolphins or chimpanzees with a worker caste and a queen and a king caste. They are all reproductive individuals, so they are not altruists in the narrow sense that evolutionary biology, how evolutionary biology defines the term, but they might display something that is altruism in the psychological.
I mean, the best examples of that biological altruism are cognitively simple. Ants and amoebas. It just seems like it's good to not overthink it.
Well, but then how do you explain humans? We're altruistic so often. It just seems unusual that.
Compared to chimpanzees, yes. I mean, compared to ants, no, not really.
Yeah, okay, fair enough.
We're a bit disappointing. And of course, there's a fascinating story to tell that it's still largely a speculative story about what happened to make us diverge from our common ancestor with the chimpanzees so that we became able to cooperate on much larger scales and much more effectively than they can. And it's kind of what the last chapter of the book is about. I think cultural evolution is crucial in understanding what happened there.
Well, I think on that note, we're almost out of time. That humans, disappointing in comparison to ants.
But not compared to chimps.
Still doing better than the chimps, yeah.
But let me thank you all again for coming. This again was the Forum for European Philosophy. I hope you visit the website and download the podcast, and we hope to see you again next time. Thank you very much.